He stepped out of the car at 2:17 a.m., alone, no driver waiting, no men posted on the corner, no second set of eyes watching the door behind him, just the sound of distant traffic and the low hum of a building that belonged to people who killed for a living. Bumpy Johnson adjusted his coat, felt the weight of nothing at his waist, and walked toward the entrance knowing that every man inside would notice the same thing at the same time. He was unarmed. That was the point. Everyone in New York knew you didn't walk into Lucky Luciano's office without protection unless you had already decided how you were going to die. Luciano didn't run a club or a bar or a backroom operation. He ran the architecture of organized crime itself. His office wasn't just a place, it was a filter. Men went in asking for favors and came out owing pieces of their future. Others never came out at all. And now a black gangster from Harlem, the man the Italians referred to behind closed doors as the problem, was walking straight into it without so much as a knife. The guards at the door didn't stop him. They didn't need to. The message had already been sent upstairs. Bumpy Johnson is here. Alone. No weapon. That sentence moved faster through the building than any elevator ever could. Inside, conversations stopped. Cigarettes burned down untouched. Cards were left face down on tables. Because this wasn't bravery. This was disruption. And disruption made powerful men nervous. The reason this night mattered had nothing to do with pride or ego. Harlem was being squeezed, slowly, quietly. The numbers game that fed thousands of black families was being bled through shell operations tied back to Italian banks. Police pressure wasn't random anymore. It was targeted. Judges who once stalled cases were suddenly efficient. Suppliers stopped extending credit. Men Bumpy had known for years started missing payments and wouldn't say why. This wasn't a street war. This was financial strangulation. And behind it stood Meyer Lansky, the accountant of the underworld, doing what he did best, turning power into paperwork. Lansky didn't hate Bumpy. That was the problem. He respected him, which meant he was willing to neutralize him cleanly. The Italians didn't want Harlem's blood. They wanted its revenue without the inconvenience of its king. Bumpy understood something most men in his position never did. If he fought back the usual way, bodies would drop and Harlem would burn, and in the end, the numbers would still belong to someone else. So he did the one thing nobody expected. He went to the source, alone. Upstairs, Lucky Luciano already knew the visit was happening. He also knew it shouldn't be possible. Men like Bumpy Johnson weren't supposed to walk into rooms like this without permission, and they definitely weren't supposed to survive doing it. Luciano had built his empire on predictability. On rules everyone understood even when they pretended not to. This visit broke those rules. When Bumpy reached the office door, no one patted him down. No one smiled. He was waved in like a man walking into his own sentencing. The door closed behind him with a sound that carried weight. Inside the room, power sat comfortably. Leather chairs, heavy desk, soft light. Luciano didn't stand. He didn't have to. He studied Bumpy the way experienced men study storms. Not with fear, but with calculation. Because only two types of men walk into death without armor. Fools, and men who know something you don't. Bumpy met his eyes without rushing his breath. He didn't speak first. Silence was the first move. And in that silence, the balance of the room shifted just enough for everyone watching to feel it, even if they couldn't explain why. Before a single word was spoken, one truth had already landed. This wasn't a plea. This wasn't a threat. This was a negotiation that could only happen once. And if it failed, Harlem wouldn't just lose its king. It would lose its future. By the time Lucky Luciano finally spoke, the decision had already been delayed longer than most men could tolerate, and that alone told Bumpy something important. Powerful men hated silence unless they were losing control of it. Luciano leaned back slightly, eyes never leaving Bumpy, and asked the only question that mattered. "Why are you here? Not who sent you. Not what do you want. Why? Bumpy answered without raising his voice. Because your money is choking my neighborhood and you know it. The words landed clean, no emotion attached, like a ledger entry. Luciano smiled faintly, the kind of smile that had buried men in shallow graves. Harlem doesn't belong to you, he said. It belongs to whoever can run it without problems. Bumpy nodded once. That's exactly why I'm here. For months, the pressure had been invisible to anyone who didn't live inside the numbers. Meyer Lansky had rerouted collections through Italian-controlled banks. Payout delays forced local runners to borrow at interest. That debt traced back to Italian lenders. Police raids increased exactly where cash flow weakened. It wasn't chaos. It was design. Lansky's design. He believed in systems, not violence. And systems didn't care about loyalty or history. To Lansky, Harlem was inefficient, too emotional, too personal, too dependent on one man. Fix the inefficiency and the rest would fall in line. Luciano knew this. He trusted Lansky because Lansky thought in numbers instead of bullets. But numbers had a blind spot. They assumed people would always choose survival over dignity. Bumpy leaned forward slightly now, just enough to change the geometry of the room. You're bleeding Harlem slow because you think I'll react fast, he said. Shoot someone. Start a war. Give you justification. I won't. Luciano's smile disappeared. You don't get to decide the pace, he replied. Bumpy shook his head. Already did. He let that sit, then continued. Every delay you force costs you more than it costs me. You're tying up capital in a neighborhood that doesn't expand. You're paying police overtime, legal fees, political favors, all to suppress an operation that still pays out because people trust me more than they fear you. Luciano drummed his fingers once on the desk. Trust is temporary. Bumpy didn't flinch. So is money when it starts moving sideways. That was the crack. Luciano understood sideways money. Money that didn't grow, didn't disappear, just stalled. Investors hated that. Crime bosses hated it more. You think you can hold Harlem without my approval? Luciano asked. No, Bumpy said. I think you can't hold it with force. And I think Meyer knows that, even if you don't like admitting it. For the first time, Luciano's eyes narrowed. You're telling me what my partner thinks now. Bumpy met the look. I'm telling you what his math doesn't show. Harlem isn't a line item. It's a pressure valve. You squeeze it too hard, and the heat moves somewhere else, somewhere louder, somewhere white people notice. That was the real threat, spoken without menace. Public attention, uncontrolled chaos, the kind that brought federal eyes. Luciano had spent his life keeping chaos managed. That was the deal. We keep violence contained. The city looks away. Bumpy straightened. You let me run Harlem clean. You get predictable income without headlines. You keep pushing, and eventually someone stupid panics. Then nobody gets what they want. Silence returned, heavier this time. Luciano stood up slowly and walked to the window. From this height, Harlem was just dark blocks and distant lights. He spoke without turning. Meyer thinks you're a variable. Bumpy replied calmly. Variables stabilize when you stop forcing them. Luciano exhaled through his nose. And what do you give me in return? Bumpy didn't hesitate. Stability. No expansion, no encroachment. Harlem stays Harlem. Italians get their cut without bodies. And you get a neighborhood that never makes the papers. Luciano turned back. And you walk out of here alive believing you set the terms. Bumpy's expression didn't change. I walk out knowing we both did. The tension didn't break. It settled. Luciano moved back to his chair and sat. I'll talk to Meyer, he said finally. Bumpy nodded. That's all I came for. He stood, already turning toward the door. Luciano stopped him with one last line. You came alone. That was either very smart or very stupid. Bumpy paused. In Harlem, he said, we don't confuse the two. He left without looking back. And if this story is hitting the way it's supposed to, make sure you're subscribed, because what happened after this meeting is where the balance of power really changed, and missing the next part means missing the move that made all of this irreversible. By the time Bumpy stepped back onto the street, nothing around the building had changed, but everything behind him had. No guards followed. No car peeled off the curb. That silence meant something had landed. Inside, Lucky Luciano didn't sit down right away. He poured a drink and stared at the door longer than he'd admit to anyone. Bumpy Johnson hadn't asked for permission. He'd framed consequences. That was dangerous. Not because it threatened Luciano's power, but because it forced him to measure it. The call to Meyer Lansky happened before dawn. Meyer listened without interrupting, the way men do when they're recalculating. When Luciano finished, Meyer didn't argue. He asked one question. Did he blink? Luciano didn't answer right away. That told Meyer enough. Lansky's concern was never pride. It was exposure. Harlem was supposed to be contained, quiet, predictable. But Bumpy had introduced uncertainty, and uncertainty made investors nervous. Over the next weeks, the squeeze loosened without announcement. Police raids shifted elsewhere. Credit lines reopened. Payments that had been delayed suddenly cleared. Nothing was returned outright, but the pressure eased just enough for Harlem to breathe again. On paper, it looked like a routine correction. In reality, it was a concession. Bumpy didn't celebrate. He watched. He knew deals like this didn't live in words, they lived in behavior. And behavior confirmed it. Italian collectors stopped testing boundaries. No new faces tried to muscle into the numbers. Messages were passed instead of threats. Harlem stayed Harlem. Meyer Lansky adjusted his models. He reclassified Bumpy Johnson from obstacle to fixed cost. That was respect in Lansky's world. Not admiration. Acceptance. The meeting changed how people spoke about Bumpy behind closed doors. He was no longer the man who controlled Harlem. He was the man who walked into Lucky Luciano's office alone and walked out with terms. That story moved faster than any gun ever could. It traveled through card rooms, back offices, union halls. Men repeated it quietly, the way you repeat a rule you don't want to test. Bumpy never confirmed it. He didn't need to. His power was in what didn't happen afterward. No war, no takeover, no headline. That absence became his signature. Years later, when people talked about Meyer Lansky's genius, they mentioned numbers, banks, offshore accounts. But the men who were there remembered the night his system met something it couldn't reduce. A man who understood that real leverage wasn't force or money, but timing and nerve. Harlem survived not because it was strong, but because it was treated as non-negotiable. And that idea outlived everyone in that room. When Bumpy died, the Italians didn't rush in. They waited. That hesitation was the real legacy of that night. One walk, one room, one conversation that rewired the map of power without spilling a drop of blood. The real shift happened quietly, the way lasting power always does. There was no announcement, no handshake photo, no public acknowledgement that anything had changed. But men who lived off patterns noticed immediately. Meetings that once happened without Harlem representation suddenly included it indirectly. Decisions that affected uptown money were no longer finalized before someone asked a simple question. What does Bumpy think? That question never appeared in writing, never showed up in minutes or ledgers, but it hovered over rooms where Meyer Lansky did his clean surgical work. Lansky didn't like variables, but he respected constraints, and Bumpy Johnson had turned himself into one. Not through force, not through chaos, but by demonstrating that removing him cost more than accommodating him. That realization altered how the Italians moved. Expansion plans were redrawn. Risk calculations were revised. Harlem stopped being a prize and became a boundary. Inside Harlem, nothing looked different to the casual eye. Numbers runners still collected, bars still paid, People still struggled. But something fundamental had changed. Fear had direction now. It no longer flowed only upward or downward. It stabilized. That stability gave Bumpy room to do what he had always done best: manage people, solve problems before they became emergencies, keep violence expensive and rare. He understood that deals like the one he forced only survived as long as they weren't tested, so he never overplayed it. No public claims, no chest beating. He didn't tell his men he'd faced Lucky Luciano alone. They heard it anyway. Stories like that don't need help spreading. They spread because powerful men hate denying them. Meyer Lansky never spoke publicly about Bumpy Johnson. He didn't have to. His actions did the talking. Funds that once bypassed Harlem now passed through agreed channels. Neutral intermediaries were used. Disputes were settled with phone calls instead of muscle. Lansky treated Harlem the way he treated Las Vegas later, as a place where stability mattered more than domination. That was the highest compliment he could give. Lucky Luciano, for his part, never invited Bumpy back. He didn't need to. That one meeting had already done its job. It established a rule without writing it down. You could negotiate with Harlem, but you couldn't ambush it. You could profit from it, but you couldn't humiliate it. Breaking that rule would invite consequences no one could fully control. And in their world, uncontrolled consequences were the only real sin. Years passed. New players rose. Old ones fell. But the shape of the map stayed the same longer than anyone expected. When outsiders asked why Harlem remained unusually insulated compared to other territories, the answer was never given directly. Men would just say it wasn't worth the trouble. That phrase carried weight because it came from people who measured worth in blood and money. Bumpy Johnson never wrote memoirs. He never clarified the story. He didn't have to. His legacy wasn't in what he said, but in what didn't happen after that night. No Italian takeover, no open war, no erasure of Harlem's internal order. That restraint traced back to a single decision made in the early hours of one night. A man walking into a room where he wasn't supposed to belong, understanding that real power wasn't about forcing a yes, but about making every other option too expensive to choose. What most people never understood was that the danger didn't end when Bumpy left Luciano's office. It only changed form. Agreements like that created expectations, and expectations created tests. Small ones at first. A collector showing up late, a payment routed the wrong way, a bookmaker pushing his luck, assuming the rules had softened. Bumpy treated every one of those moments like a diagnostic. He didn't explode. He corrected. Quietly. Precisely. The message was always the same. The deal stands because I stand. The Italians noticed the consistency. Meyer Lansky noticed something else. The absence of escalation meant Bumpy wasn't using the agreement as leverage for expansion. He wasn't trying to grow bigger. He was trying to stay intact. That made him predictable, and predictability was the closest thing to trust Lansky ever offered. Over time, Harlem became a reference point. When other territories flared up, men compared them to Harlem and asked why it stayed calm. The answer was never tactical. It was personal. One man had forced recognition instead of submission. That distinction mattered. Lucky Luciano never admitted it, but he adjusted his own thinking after that night. He became more cautious about underestimating outsiders who didn't fit the usual mold. Bumpy Johnson wasn't Italian. He wasn't connected by blood or tradition, but he understood structure, and that made him dangerous in a way brute force never was. When Luciano eventually fell, deported and sidelined, the framework he'd built still carried the imprint of that meeting. Even in absence, the rule held. Harlem was not to be destabilized casually. Bumpy aged into his position without softening it. He became less visible, more selective. Younger men mistook that for weakness. They were corrected quickly, not with violence but with exclusion. Doors stopped opening. Information stopped flowing. In that world, being cut off was worse than being threatened. By the time Bumpy's health began to fail, his power no longer depended on fear or reputation. It depended on precedent, on the fact that once, when everything pointed toward bloodshed, he chose a third option and made it stick. That was why, when he finally died, there was no rush, no scramble, no immediate land grab. Men waited to see if the old rule still applied. That hesitation was proof that it did. The night Bumpy Johnson walked into Lucky Luciano's office alone didn't just protect Harlem in that moment. It taught the people who mattered that control didn't always come from dominance. Sometimes it came from knowing exactly where to stand so that everyone else had to adjust around you. And that kind of power didn't announce itself. It simply endured.